Live streaming.
Okay.
Boom.
I got my store of value Cyber Hornet
What a beautiful sight.
Satoshi shirt on in honor of the Cyber Hornets today.
Well, this interview, this discussion came about because of them. So I guess thanks are in order to the Cyber Hornets and the plebs and the maximalists for pressuring you into doing this.
John, the Cyber Hornets are, I mean, they're out there representing you. Apparently, by the way, the real question is, what is it about you that makes the Cyber Hornets so intensely loyal that they would badger me to death until I came on the show?
I don't, that's a question for the Cyber Hornets, but I suspect it has something to do with the fact that I tend to like to get into the deeper parts of the rabbit hole in my discussions when I talk about Bitcoin. I think the macro stuff and the economic and financial case and the investment case is all very well and good and interesting. But at this point, it seems so obvious to the point of almost boredom. And, I love the guys like Raul and Preston and Lynn and all those, phenomenal people that are doing great work. But I get it. I know what the investment case is and I've known for a long time. What I'm interested in is what are the implications of having this thing emerge on the world, and what does it mean for society, for individual behavior, for interaction, for the future, and that's I think that's part of it. You'll have to ask them when you interact with them more online and stuff, but I think that's most of it.
Yeah, well, I agree with you. My issue with the macroeconomists and the financiers is sometimes they sugarcoat everything because they're thinking I have to describe it in such a way that somebody else that's less committed, that's less insightful than me will agree with a small portion of my argument. So they'll give me money. And you keep dumbing it down through 3 or 4 or 5 layers, and then there's nothing left. Like, for example, what is Bitcoin to me? It's like fire. It's going to change the civilization. What is Bitcoin to you? Well, it's an uncorrelated asset. And if you put 2% of your portfolio in an uncorrelated asset, you'll have less volatility. And let's back test this for a decade and see whether or not this might be an uncorrelated volatility reducing thing. And I think, man, that's it's like, so what is the word?
So
like
narrow.
Bitcoin deserves better than that. But also I give you fire and you can conquer the world, change the civilization, reroute the course of human history. And you want to call that an uncorrelated asset?
Yeah,
like it's
exactly.
It's a 1%, a 2%. We want people to do a 1% allocation to an uncorrelated asset. And I'm seeing aqueducts and roads and airplanes. And I think, and their defense would be like, we have to talk to the investment advisors in language they understand. But I would disagree. I think it underestimates the strength of human intellect. I think that if you explain to them that this is an engineering breakthrough, and the first time in human history, we have a monetary network that will store and channel energy without power loss. It's like a railroad. It's like mass transit. It's something extraordinary that's going to be an underpinning of civilization. There were investors that invested in Standard Oil, and there were investors that invested in U.S. Steel. In fact, the greatest of financial investors is JP Morgan, and he's the guy that actually put together the merger that created U.S. Steel, when he merged Carnegie's interest with the other steel interest. It's like they got it. And I think that investors will get this too. I don't think you got to dumb it down and say something like it's an uncorrelated asset to decrease the volatility in your investment portfolio.
Yeah, I think that's an extremely narrow way to put it. And like you said, I think people put it in that way because they think they're speaking the language of the people that they're trying to entice into this thing. For some people, and I'm sure we both had a lot of these conversations, if you go in with, this is literally the incorruptible substance that will transform humanity, well, you might lose some people in that way. So to my mind, understanding the macro arguments is good and a good use of time insofar as it allows you to speak the language to get to the real point that you're trying to make. You know, so I talk to a lot of people in that world as well. And if you can make that case, then it's almost like you get to the next level. Nothing, you know, pleases me more than to just jam out on at the depths of the rabbit hole. You know, I think that's where the interest in this lies. That's where, you know, to me, Bitcoin is literally stunning. You know, when I think about it, it's almost like it kind of washes away the thoughts in your mind, and you're in awe almost. And then that awe gets pushed into different, you know, lines of thinking that emerge in your mind as a result, and being in that sort of meditative stunned state. And that's where I like to hang out with the plebs. You know, I like to get the plebs on, whether they're quote unquote well-known Bitcoiners or nobodies, and got on and talk about where they've come to in those explorations. So that's what my interest is. And I, you know, I've noticed in your tweets lately, and I, you know, obviously you deal in both worlds as well. And I'm sure you have to speak like the language of the macro stuff so as to not come off too, you know, crazy right off the hop. But in your tweets and stuff, you're coming out with a lot of these great insights that I think has endeared you to the plebs and the maximalists and the cyber hornets for that very reason, because that's the depth and the level that they're at, as you know, as the shirt that you're wearing implies. So what has been your experience in straddling those two when you're making the case for Bitcoin to the people in your worlds?
Well, I think everybody resonates with a different set of metaphors, and it also depends on their context. So, for example, if you're meeting with pure institutional investors in a formal institutional context, then there's 6 people watching in a big room, or 6 or 12 or 16 people. Then you would use that very formal language of whatever uncorrelated, you know, synthetic safe haven asset. You know, you could use that, but on the other hand, what I've found in life is you have a very different conversation with 8 people on the team when their boss is there and when the 8 people are sitting next to each other than when you have a one-on-one conversation with them. And the conversation, if the conversation is a formal meeting with a hierarchical set of supervisors, it has to be very constrained. If the conversation was a one-on-one meeting in a business setting between 9 and 5, it would be about here. And if the conversation was a one-on-one meeting outside of business, like, you know, I want to have a heart-to-heart with you, John. It's like, let's go out to dinner. And we have dinner. And of course, that would be a different thing than if I stood up in front of 50 people at church on a Sunday. So you almost have 4 different venues, right? The sermon, the social, the one-on-one professional, and then the formal business meeting. And the metaphors and the semantics you're allowed to use are different. And by the same person sitting in the one formal meeting that would always go to the antiseptic sterile metaphor, if you caught them one-on-one off site, right, they might open up to you and they would have the more spiritual discussion. And sometimes they feel like, well, I can't in front of my boss or my peers. And sometimes they feel like, well, it wouldn't be polite, right? Or it wouldn't be appropriately professional. So even if they believe it, they won't always share it. Can I tell you one really funny story I had in this regard? You know, when we bought Bitcoin corporately, the most challenging environment, a publicly traded company is going to buy Bitcoin on behalf of other public shareholders, right? So everybody's walking on eggshells. What will the shareholders think? And we went to great lengths to treat the shareholders very transparently and respectfully. To the extent that we tendered to buy $250 million worth of our own stock at a premium, so as to give everybody an option to either buy, to opt into MicroStrategy with Bitcoin, or to exit at a profit if they didn't like the idea. That's how, when you spend $250 million in order to cushion the message. It's a lot of commitment, right? But having said that, so we announced the tender offer, and then my finance people said, I said, well, how do the shareholders think about this? They said, well, they're all generally pretty okay with it, but there's this one shareholder, this one investor who doesn't like it. And I said, so, and I'm going to meet with them today, right? They're like, yeah, we've lined up a bunch of meetings. So get ready for this one, because this guy really doesn't like Bitcoin at all. And you should just get ready for that. So I'm like, okay, suit up, go into battle. And the meeting starts and we start talking. And I said, yeah. And so we purchased Bitcoin because we have this macroeconomic view, and we view Bitcoin as a great way to preserve the purchasing power and the treasury of the company. And our alternative is to decapitalize the company completely and give all the money back to the shareholders, but then we won't have any capital. And the guy's like, yeah. And then he goes, so tell me more about this. And he said, tell me more about this. I said, well, let me tell you about Bitcoin. I said, Bitcoin, is a decentralized, crypto application on a proof of work
and he
network.
said, I don't need to know all that. I know all that shit already, right?
And he literally cuts me off, and he goes, oh, I already know that. I own Bitcoin.
Right.
And so here's the point. Secretly, privately, he agrees with you. He agrees with me. He's already got it. In his role as a public representative of his investment company, he had to push back.
Yeah.
And so sometimes the same person that believes one thing privately, and by the way, he had to push back reflexively, but then when we had a one-on-one, he's like, I get it. No problem. I'm like, and they're like, well, how did it go? I'm like, oh, it's fine. It's fine. He owns it. Yeah. So by the way, and then in my private meeting with my investment advisors, they're telling me you got to be concerned, but this is a big problem. And you can imagine the ripple, which is like, by the time you go through 7 layers, it was like, oh, there's going to be a big problem if you do this. This is that you got to do this. You can imagine why people act so constrained and conservative in their views when they're being filtered through layers. But if you manage to build a communication channel directly one-on-one, you'll actually generally be pleasantly surprised at the insight of humanity.
Yeah. And I think that point precisely is one of the big takeaways this year. And, it's been talked about a ton, so we don't have to dwell on it too much, but the likes of you, Paul Tudor Jones, and a few others in the space, just kind of de-risking these conversations generally, so that, because before, in some instances, you couldn't even have them, they'd be dismissed outright. And now you can at least have them. Yes, you have to structure them a bit differently. You have to use a certain language. You have to take a certain track, but at least you can have them. And then, as you just articulated, once you peel back the onion a bit, you realize, well, more people are interested in this than it seemed on the surface, right? I had a similar conversation with a friend a couple nights ago. Went out to dinner, and the service was really slow, so it ended up being like a 3-hour wait before it was all said and done. And so we had lots of time to chat, and he was kind of on the side of, capitalism is kind of broken, wealth concentrates too much, we really need to fix the system and stuff. And I kind of took the track of, it's not capitalism that's broken, it's the rails on which capitalism runs that's broken, i.e. the currency. And if we could run it on a different currency, an incorruptible currency, a fair currency like Bitcoin, then we might see some of those problems dissipate. And it may end up being the most optimal way of organizing and coordinating human economic interaction that we have. And we went down all the money rabbit hole and the economics, and we settled on this thing, because he was like, yeah, but what about gold? And I said, well, gold, long history and everything, but I framed it in terms of money is such an important substance. It's the highest concentration of, as you say, energy, our essence, our collective value and productivity, that it attracts all of our worst attributes as humans, right? So it has to be impervious. It has to be able to repel our malice and our corruption and all those other things, if it's going to continue to serve as what we want it to serve as, that coordinating mechanism. And its properties will dictate how well it is at repelling those things. And I think the story of gold is that it worked worked as well as it could be expected, but not well enough. It couldn't, its property of, let's say, physicality and centralization meant that it was more susceptible to our corruptive nature And that's what we did to it. And here we are. And, you know, what I finished with is, what if Bitcoin, and, you know, I know we both love Robert Breedlove. I think the recognition that he makes of Bitcoin potentially being that alchemical concept of the incorruptible substance, if it really is that thing, and I know he didn't introduce that term, but he introduced it certainly, I think, to the Bitcoin Cyber Hornet lexicon. If it really is that thing, then even if there's a 1% chance of it being that thing, isn't it worth your time investigating it? Isn't it worth your time learning enough about it to decide whether or not you should, you know, be engaging it in some capacity? And to, you know, to my satisfaction, I guess at the end of it, he said, if that's the case, then yeah, it's probably worth looking at.
You know, one idea, I mean, it may be a big idea, is maybe the world would be a better place if the engineers ran the monetary system instead of the politicians ran the monetary system.
No shit.
Because on the left hand, you have the domain of politicians, and on the right hand, you have the domain of the engineers. And, you know, like, how would you feel if you had a nuclear power plant and a politician showed up and started telling you how to set up the, you know, the rods?
Exactly.
Right? Like, nobody would think, they would never consider allowing political interference in most complex engineering systems, because you know, any third grader would say, you don't do that, you're gonna have a meltdown, right? You're gonna kill us all. Yeah. And so in the domain of engineering, engineers submit their decisions to the laws of nature and conservation of energy, and there are rules, and they're not allowed to break them. And if they break them, right, the engineering systems fail. But in the domain of politics, right, there are no rules, and so it's all relative. And Bitcoin represents the singularity where engineering finally impinges upon economics. It's the first engineered monetary system in the history of the world, right? And I think we underestimate the engineering element here in the memes and in the metaphors. People trust engineers. I mean, every time you get on an airplane and you find a 747 halfway around the world, I'm an aeronautical engineer. It's a miracle that you can take off in an airplane in New York and you can land alive in London or Paris. If you had any inkling of all the ways that you can die, and inkling of all of the engineering challenges you had to overcome, and if a politician came along and said, we just thought we would take one of the wings off the airplane, or we would add 3 more, right? I mean, no one would think about it. So I think that the magic of Bitcoin is that engineering is arriving to economics for the first time in human history. Mm-hmm. And the challenge of gold, you know, to your point, is number one, it's a corruptible monetary system because it's centralized. And number two, it's not a closed monetary system. It's an open monetary system. I mean, a closed engineering system would have 21 million things in it, and only heat can come in and go out. The mass can't come in and go out. Bitcoin is a closed system because there's 21 million Bitcoins, and you can heat it up, you can cool it down. All closed thermodynamic systems are like that. That's the definition of a closed system. Closed systems are a pretty good idea, right? An open system is when I can put more mass in or take mass out. Open systems have problems. You know, you can't solve for a solution in an open system because of the question of what mass is coming and going. And in gold, right, the openness is I can mine more gold. I don't know how much gold will come and go. And so if I was building a monetary energy network on gold, it's corruptible and it's not closed. If I then I rebuilt the monetary energy network on Bitcoin, and it's closed system, and it's hopefully not corruptible, but certainly a lot less corrupt. It's crypto, you know, resistant to corruption. It's the best anti-corrupt system we could come up with in the history of the world. And I think that's a really important idea to spread for people to start to grasp, because I think you'll win over all the engineers in the world to Bitcoin when they start to understand that somebody engineered a monetary system for the first time in human history. Because if there's anything we all agree on, we kind of generally like our engineering.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. And I think always with a paradigm shift of this scale, or perhaps there's never been one of this scale, but with all paradigm shifts, I think they're difficult to spot. And so sometimes it's a wonder that the people that you would think most likely to spot it early, like the engineers, like the economists, like the gold bugs or whatever. So, this one, it can be so foreign that they miss it. And I think that happened early days in this. I think that's changing now. But do you have people in your life that you can jam out about this stuff with in person? I know you're doing the rounds on the podcast lately and you're on Twitter mixing it up with the plebs, but here you are wearing a Bitcoin shirt. You're fully orange pilled. Do you have people in your life that you can just sit around the fire and talk about this stuff with?
Well, the OG was Eric Weiss, and Eric introduced me to Bitcoin. And so we sit around and talk about it. Eric was in the business many years before. He discovered Bitcoin when I was sure that it was a fad and I couldn't be bothered. And I forgot that I had an opinion, right?
2013 or whatever it was.
So we talk about it a lot more, but I'm making converts, right? Like you know how it is when you get orange pilled. Pretty soon you start spreading that to other people around you. And I've got my requisite friends that I've got the speculators, the guys that buy it and sell it and think it's volatile and they brag about buying it and sell it. And then I've got the ones that were inspired to buy some more and then sell some more. And I'm swatting them down like, you idiot. Why are you trading this stuff? It's like trading Bitcoin is a sign of like a lesser intellect, in Absolutely. My opinion. It's like, I'm like, come to your senses, just buy it and hold it.
Exactly. I imagine our respective, all the Bitcoin maximalists, our message inboxes would be hilarious to read because, these days a lot of us are probably getting hit up with interest in Bitcoin because of the price action and the macro environment. And knowing the maximalists as I do, I know how harshly we swat down the trading, the shit coining, the everything else. And I'd love, even just my inbox, it's always like, don't be a fucking moron. Don't you I want you to buy this and I don't want you to think about selling it. And certainly not selling it for, paper money. If in the future you want to convert it for a service or a good, then that's allowable. But I don't want you to think about selling it for 5 to 10 years. I want you to secure it as if your life depended on it. And I don't want you to ever think about trading it or, going in the shitcoin casino. And the language is so, like, as you said, slapping them around, like in a manner that they're probably not used to, right?
Like, yeah, it's my friend.
That's how we all talk Eric, to our friends now.
Eric, it's like picking up pennies on the railroad track.
Exactly.
It's like, you're going to get a few quarters and you're going to get hit by a train too. Like if you roll the clock back to 2007, Steve Jobs invents the iPhone. And, people thought, oh, it's a toy. By 2009, the iPhone's got an app store. And if you understood anything about software, the iOS is a new operating system, and it's going to be its own ecosystem, at least as important as the web. And it's going to spawn an entire new generation of applications, right? And the mobile wave is responsible for what, like $5 trillion, $5 to $10 trillion of wealth over the next decade. Can you imagine someone sitting around saying, oh, I get mobile device technology, and you're trying to time the market in Apple stock in 2011? Like you're buying and selling Apple stock in 2011. You want to shake them. Like, are you out of your mind? I'm trading Facebook stock back and forth between $8 a share and $4 a share and $12 a share. And you just want to do this. Like, do you not understand that one day every single person on the planet is going to have one of these things in their pocket and it's going to go up by a factor of 100? And you're trying to like trade Apple stock between $1.25 and $1.17 and bragging about how you bought it at $1.25 and sold it at $2.11. And have you figured out the consequences of being short the share if it goes up by $100? Like the amount that, like, are you out of your mind? Like, because, by the way, like I spent 30 years in the business and I obsess over this every single freaking minute of the day. And I wrote a book on it, right? I wrote the book. I predicted the future. You know, I made $500 million investing in these things, right? And I started, and I put a small amount of capital in. And let me tell you one thing, John, I can't time the market. I have no freaking clue. Like, you know, in 2009, 2010, 2011, 2012, I have no clue. And I'm certain nobody in the world understood it better than me. Like, some people might have made more money than me, but you know, like all these people that think that somehow they're going to time the market and they're going to guess, it's probably 10,000 times harder to time the market when you know the future than it is to sit and to wait for a decade. And like, you know, the Bitcoin thing, this kind of is working in 12 weeks or 24 weeks. But when I did this, I didn't expect it to work in 12 weeks. I did it thinking that in 1 to 3 years, people will think I'm not an idiot. And in 10 years, I'll be happy I did it. And I'm ready to get beat to death for the first 1-2 years if people are going to beat me to death, because you could have been beat to death on Facebook stock and Apple stock and Google stock and whatever in a 1 to 2, 3 year time frame. There's anybody that tells you that they actually know the direction of this stuff over the course of days or weeks or months, they're deluding themselves and they're deluding you. And it's almost comical because they all hold themselves out as being like experts in something. And like, I have been the expert in something. And the one thing that I knew was I had no, you know, the only time I ever lost money on Apple, the only time. But can you imagine losing money on Apple stock investing in the last 20 years at any point in time from 1997? There's not a single way, John, you could have lost money betting on Apple stock as a hodler in 22 years, except I did it. I'm going to tell you how I did it. I bought an option. I bought a leap. I actually bought a call option, but not short, long. I went long Apple stock. I bought call. By the way, I'm not going to go long Apple stock with a 30 or 60 or 90-day option. I bought an 18-month leap option on Apple stock. The stock traded down. It stayed down 17 months, 18 months. My option expired. I lost the premium and the stock shot up. And I'm saying, I freaking predicted the future. I wanted some leverage. I'm so angry. And the takeaway from that is, if you believe in something and you have conviction, buy the underlying asset, ideally with very low leverage or no leverage, and hold it forever.
Yeah.
You know, like, and all these other cute things, like you get cute. It's like, how could I be wrong in 18 months? It was 19 months, John. And I was right in 19 months and the option expired. It's almost like God punishing me for trying to be cute and gamble with this sort of thing. It's like,
yeah. And I think, you know, there's two, you said, why would anyone ever do that when it's so clear that the safest and most effective option is just to buy and hodl? I think the two reasons is, one, you either got something to sell, and I know you've had some discussions with people that may be in that category recently, or your time preference is such that, you know, you have a very high time preference, and so you're trying to make your gains immediately. I don't think you've properly assessed what that looks like over the course of 5, 10, 20 years, but you know, that's the choice you make. But it's an even more dangerous bet. You know, you're talking about Apple, but you know, with Bitcoin, there's an anxiety that if you let it go, you may not be able to get it back. I mean, I know it's an open market, it's liquid 24/7, but when you have an asset like this that has the level and degree of scarcity that Bitcoin has, and that has so much, like when people get Bitcoin, they don't just, as we were saying a little bit earlier, like the people that are making a 1% allocation, they're looking at the technical analysis, they're looking at its past performance and saying, maybe this will balance my portfolio. When you fully go down the rabbit hole, you know, you want to put all of your available, you know, that if it, whatever doesn't impair or impinge on your, you know, lifestyle,